So how could regulation of the internet work? Well, Catherine Miller is Director of Policy at the think tank Doteverone, and Mal Fletcher is a social commentator and futurist. Mal, perhaps not surprising that everybody acknowledges that being online can be dangerous.
Well, it was surprising not that long ago, actually, Barry. It's only been in recent times that people have gotten a bit more educated. And I've been pushing and advocating, perhaps Catherine has too, for a long time, that there need to be at least health warnings published by some of these big companies. I mean, Facebook, by way of example, recently was faced with new research about its links to depression. And it said that the answer was to engage with Facebook even more. Now, if a drug company acknowledged it had problems with mental health among its users and then said, well, take even more of our drug and you'll feel fine, there'd be a furore. And I think we need to hold these companies accountable at least to that level.
And what do you think, Catherine?
I agree with Mal that this is something that's really come to the fore over the past year, and there's been an incredible change from an attitude generally that tech companies were impossible to regulate. They were too big, too fast, crossed too many sectors. It would kill off innovation, to a recognition, even amongst the tech companies. You know, Mark Zuckerberg said to Congress earlier in the summer, it's not a question of whether there's regulation, it's a question of what kind of regulation and what's the right kind of regulation. And what's really exciting about hearing Ofcom engaging in this is that we're starting to get into that nitty-gritty of what is the right kind of regulation. And I would certainly argue that it's not going to be the one that Mark Zuckerberg comes up with. And it's really encouraging to hear organisations like Ofcom getting involved in that.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it, when you self-police, I suppose, Mal, is that you perhaps are not going to go far enough and you're certainly not going to harm your financial interests.
No, you're not. And that's the interesting thing about big tech companies, that they purport on one hand to be the freewheeling innovators, the young entrepreneurs of the digital Wild West, and on the other they behave like big corporations, spending multiplied millions of dollars or pounds on organised lobbying of governments at home and abroad. So they can't have it both ways, you know, and I think we've got to start treating them as corporations. We've got to start dealing certainly with the health aspect. I mean, I was reading again today about dopamine addiction. Dopamine is that chemical we associate with feelings of alertness and pleasure. And studies continually show that every time now we take to social media, we inject at least a small dose of dopamine into our brains. A small dose once off is not a problem, but many small doses fairly frequently can have the same cumulative effect as single large doses, producing addiction. So this is a problem that at the very least these companies need to own up to and to warn people about.
But yeah, I mean, apart from issuing warnings, though, I mean, we issue warnings about eating fatty food, about smoking, about all sorts of things, but people don't necessarily listen. How would you enforce that, Mal?
Well, it's just a first step. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the government does with regulation, because it will be among the first national governments in the world to do anything to regulate these companies. There's been moves in America, but, you know, there's a lot of argument going on there. I think it will be exciting to see what they do come up with. I'm not sure how they will, you know, put it into the statute books, but I do think there needs to be some responsibility taken by these companies for the fact that they are now huge corporations. They're not just platforms for other people's content. They are, in effect, the news providers, the opinion shapers of our time, and they need to take social responsibility.
So, Catherine, if you were Ofcom, how would you go about regulating it?
Well, and it's very difficult for Ofcom because the nature of being an independent regulator is they can't actually say, do you know what, we need these powers and please give them to us. But I think the principles that Sharon White laid out today are a good foundation. So she talks about the need for flexible regulation. So this is really important, and it has been very problematic across the board that regulators are stuck with really restrictive rules. For example, the Electoral Commission counts the amount of spending on leaflets, but can't count the amount of spending on digital advertising because it's got such prescriptive rules. So Sharon White's talking about principles-based regulation that gives a kind of framework for a regulator to work within. She also recognises the internet is different, so there's no point just transposing what Ofcom does with broadcasters to the internet. You have to deal with the fact that the amount of content is just unimaginable compared to regulating a broadcaster's content. And she also talks about the need for independence and credibility, which I think is totally fundamental to this. What I would really like to stress, though, is Mal was talking there about health warnings. We can't let regulation put more burden onto people who use these technologies. You know, the technologies are designed to be addictive. They're designed to be frictionless. And it's not fair to ask individuals to take responsibility for enforcing that. So regulation has to be aimed upstream at the companies, and I would say specifically at the business models. So rather than regulating content that has, which is pernicious, which is inflammatory, look at what it is in the business model of social media companies in particular that encourages people to agitate, that encourages people to create this kind of content which will get a lot of attention. And that's really at the root of the problem.
And Catherine, just briefly, is that difficult though when you're trying to regulate companies that are based overseas?
Absolutely. And I think the important thing for those of us who advocate regulation, the important thing to admit to is it's not a magic solution. We're not going to solve all the problems. And the fact that these companies are enormous, hugely wealthy and transnational remains incredibly challenging. The solution to that is not to throw your hands up in the air and say nothing is possible. We need to get started and do what is possible.
So, Mal, I mean, you said that they should display health warnings. What about this idea of going after their business model? Do you think that's practical too?
I think it could be if we were, going at them not necessarily in a punitive way for business sake, but going at them because of health issues and because of the effects on social cohesion, for example. I mean, you look at the Me Too movement in social media today. I think it's very important issues that are raised there. But we've seen in recent times a spate of what I'd call pseudo-apologies from people accused of doing the wrong thing. They say things like, I don't remember behaving that way, but if I offended anyone, I'm sorry. That's not a real apology. It's an attempt to avoid the baying mob on social media. So when things like that happen, I think regulation should be able to step in, and it would, Catherine is right, be a very different kind of regulation to say, listen, this has to stop and we draw the line here. I will be very intrigued to see what Ofcom is given permission to do and then what the government takes up.
Mal, thank you for that. That's Mal Fletcher there. And also we heard from Catherine Miller.